Historians, what is the craziest thing you've ever studied? Learnt about this in school. In the 1950s in Borneo they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria. So, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch that people's homes were made of, and thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which were eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't, and the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly, and that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem led to cats being airdropped into Borneo. President Andrew Jackson was walking out of the Capitol building with his buddy Congressman Davy Crockett. A man approached them, drew a gun, but it misfired. The man drew a second gun, which also misfired. Andrew Jackson, fairly old at this point, lifted his cane and began beating the would-be assassin. Normally, people would react with justice served, but Jackson was beating him so badly that Davy Crockett had to pull Jackson off his would-be assassin, who was arrested shortly after. The would-be assassin stood trial, represented by lawyer Francis Scott Key, author of The Star-Spangled Banner, and was the first American to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Edit: Crockett was in the House, not the Senate. So, the Han heard the kin were fond of mega projects and massive infrastructure investments, so they found a hydraulics engineer and sent him over to sell them on an absurd canal idea: build a massive canal to use runoff water from two flood-prone rivers to irrigate worthless plains. Tame the river's flooding, irrigate wasteland, everybody wins. And in the Han schemes, it's an absurdly large project that will keep the kin diverted and invested for decades. And it does. Except about halfway through, the kin cotton onto this and confront their hydraulics engineer, Zheng Gao, presumably confronted with whatever creative thing or things they do to spies and saboteurs, throws himself on kin mercy. Yeah, I'm a spy. Yeah, it was to sabotage your efforts, but I'm really an engineer, guys, and this will really work, honest. Let me finish it, and please don't do that thing with the cheese grater. The kin, presumably, conclude they can always torture him to death later and let him remain in charge of the project. And wonder of wonders, it works. Thousands of hectares or rich but fallow desert are turned into fertile farmland. Existing farmland is made safer by giving the flooding rivers runoff channels. The canal makes the kin rich beyond their already immense wealth, which they turn to larger armies, eventually crushing the Han and, briefly, uniting China. That reminds me of the story of how a Chinese engineer named Zeman Bao proved religion is a con and abolished human sacrifice in China. Zeman Bao was an engineer and a rationalist who lived during the Warring States period in China. He served as a magistrate for the Marquis Wen, who ruled the territory of Wei from 445 BC 396 BC. During that time, the province of Yi, in what is now Hebei, began to decline and falter. The Marquis sent Zeman Bao to find out what was wrong. Zeman Bao visited the main town of Yi on the river Zhang. He was dismayed to find the fertile countryside depopulated. Whole families were fleeing productive farms and leaving the rich land fallow. The peasants feared the capricious god of the river, who could cause flooding and death, or alternately drought and starvation, but they feared the crushing taxes imposed upon them by the regional governor even more. Most of all, they feared a local witch who selected maidens from the area as brides for the river. Chosen girls were dressed in finery and tightly bound to sumptuously decorated floating platforms which were then sunk. These human sacrifice extravaganzas were the purported cause of the high taxes as well. The governor levied annual taxes for the ceremony and then kept a majority of the proceeds for himself and his cronies. People who complained discovered that their daughters were chosen as brides. Upon finding this out, Zeman Bao arrived at one of the marriage celebrations with a troop of Wei soldiers. As the ceremony started, he proclaimed the girl unworthy of the river god. He commanded the witch to go down to the riverbed and ask the river god whether the previous brides had been satisfactory. When she began to equivocate, the soldiers threw her into the river, where she quickly sank beneath the current. When the witch didn't return, Zeman asked the governor's cronies to see what was taking her so long. The soldiers then threw them in the river to drown as well. Zeman Bayo sarcastically suggested that the witch and the officials were having lunch with the river god. He was about to send the regional governor to fetch them when the governor fell to his knees and begged forgiveness for the scheme. Zeman Bayo stripped the governor of position and holdings and then probably tortured him to death, as was customary at the time. He used the proscribed wealth to build a series of dams and irrigation canals to bring the unruly river under control. Zeman Bayo is still revered for being the first Chinese official to tame a river by means of civil engineering, cunning administration, and, above all, the ability to see that religion was a con trick. In 1918, British MP Noel Pemberton Boleyn caused a major scandal when he accused actress Maud Allen and Margaret Asquith, wife of the previous Prime Minister, of being at the center of a homosexual ring sabotaging the war effort. Evidence included Allen having performed in a play by Oscar Wilde and Asquith having attended the performance. He presented his case in an article entitled The Cult of the Clitoris, in which he claimed the exiled Prince of Albania had a black book listing all the blackmailed homosexuals in Britain. Horses evolved in North America, spread during prehistorical times into Asia, and then later went extinct in North America. If things had been only slightly different, horses could have been native only to the Americas, or just completely extinct by prehistory. Not having horses would have made a huge difference to Asian and European history. No Mongol invasions, no European knights. Probably how Pepsi briefly became the 6th largest military in the world. In 1959. President Eisenhower wanted to show the Soviet Union how great America was, so the government set up an American National Exhibition and sent Vice President Nixon there. Well, Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev got in an argument over communism vs capitalism. As it got heated, the president of Pepsi stepped in and was like, "Bro Khrushchev, chill out, have a Pepsi." Khrushchev most have loved that crap, because then the Soviet Union wanted to permanently bring Pepsi over to their country. The problem is that their money wasn't accepted throughout the world. Instead, like true Russians, the Soviet Union traded vodka for Pepsi. This was all good until the late 1980s, when their contract was going to expire, and vodka wouldn't cut it for payment. So instead they traded Pepsi a fuck-ton of submarines and warships for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. Sadly, instead of terrorizing the seas and shooting harpoons at their enemies, Pepsi decided to sell the fleet to a Swedish scrap metal company.
Thanks for watching.